Welcome to Journey Through Time. I'm David Olusoga, and this is the third in our four-part series on the life of Harriet Tubman and the story of the Underground Railway. And we ended last time as Harriet's first step in her career as an official conductor on the Underground Railway, transporting enslaved people from the south to the north, from slavery to freedom.
What comes next, David, is the part that people remembered about her career, what has survived in the record about what made her so legendary. She developed a system, and as we've been saying over the course of her story, her intelligence is very clear, and that really comes through in the methods that she developed. So Harriet Tubman always pulled fugitives out on a Saturday night. And this is because the enslaved often had permission to visit their family on Sundays or other kinds of traveling passes on Sundays. So what does that mean? It means that they're not going to be missed until Monday morning because nobody expects to see them around on Sunday.
And people are visiting families because slavery has broken up families. Couples have been separated. People's children might live miles away in a different plantation owned by a different family. So that's, in some ways, this is a weakness of the slave system created by slavery itself.
And another weakness is that no fugitive notices can be printed until Monday at the earliest. What that also means then is that no ads for fugitive slaves, the runaway notices that we've been talking about, those aren't printed until Monday because you don't realize that they've run until Monday, which means that the newspaper doesn't come out until Tuesday. So no news of the escape starts to circulate until Tuesday at the earliest, which basically gave her a 48 hours head start every time. She also liked to run in the autumn and winter when the nights are longer. They're running at night, hiding during the day. So go when the nights are longer, the days are shorter. But also, famously, she and the people who knew her said that winter nights are the nights when people who have homes stay in them. So fewer people out on the road looking for you in the winter.
But it makes, of course, the process of escape more painful, more arduous, because people are out in those cold months. But these are people choosing to escape from slavery. They're choosing to escape from a brutal system. So a few weeks of cold nights out in the open is not going to deter them.
And because they've survived such physical brutality all their lives, for the most part anyway, it's not as if they're escaping from warm, comfortable houses to begin with. So they're used to incredibly difficult conditions. And this time, there's a reason for it. It will bring them to freedom if they persevere. There's another reason for choosing winter, however, which is that New Year's Day was often when enslavers would sell people. And in the border states, that often meant that they would sell them south. The reason for that is, again, because of winter. So the winter slowdown in working in the fields and the new year makes it a natural time for people to settle their accounts, to sign new contracts, to get everything organized, because so you're selling and hiring out people without disrupting the agricultural cycle.
And you know at this point in the 1850s that there is a market for enslaved people in the South, in the huge cotton plantations, which are the boom economy of the United States in those decades.
So, and because New Year's Day is the first day of the year, it starts to become a little bit of a ritual that this is when they will lead enslaved people to the market, to an auction block, and sell them off. So much so that enslaved families called New Year's Day Hiring Day or Heartbreak Day, because it was when they were most likely to be split up. So Harriet ran in the winter so that she could get them out first. The people that she helped usually escaped on foot. Occasionally she used boats, not very often, but sometimes. But she's also remarkably one of the first conductors to use the actual railroads herself.
The physical railroads rather than the metaphorical underground railroad we've been talking about.
Yeah, the actual train. So Harriet, it's so audacious. I love it. Harriet would travel into the South by train. She'd hop on a train, she'd get some money together from some of the abolitionist anti-slavery activists who are helping her get the money for a ticket. And she did so because she said that nobody would believe that a Black woman would get on a train and travel into a slave state.
Well, it is almost unbelievable. You can see why she came to that conclusion. It is a remarkable, in some ways, crazy thing to be doing. And so it was not something that would lead to suspicion. Why would she?
Yeah, exactly. So they just assume that she's on, an errand for a master, an enslaver, and that's just what they would assume. So she would travel into the slave state on the train, but of course she wouldn't travel out that way with her group of passengers, the people that she's conducting into freedom. So she would lead them out on foot. And then after the trip, when they reach freedom in the US, a city like Philadelphia or New York, then she'd scrape together the money to get them rail fares to Canada. So once they're in the Free State in the north, then they can travel by train themselves and then get to Canada, where they're beyond the reach of the fugitive slave law, as we said. So you don't take a direct route to Canada, both to stay hidden, so it's harder to follow the trail, and also because it's cheaper. So those two things work together and help protect people as well.
And we know that she's going to the States for the most part of Maryland, where she had been enslaved, but also Virginia. But she doesn't go to the deep South.
No. So as we said before, she's not reckless. And so she goes to areas where she knows people. These are border states. So that means that the journey itself is shorter back to freedom. So she's not going to go all the way to Mississippi and then hope that she can get all the way back up again. I mean, that would just be, I think that would really be lunatic. And she's, anything but. So she goes to the states that are near to the borders and also to areas that she knows, Maryland and increasingly Virginia. And as we'll hear in a moment, the knowledge that she acquires of Virginia actually becomes really important to the way that not just her story unfolds, but to the story of American history and the Civil War. Even though she's no longer only conducting her own relatives to freedom, she is often working to reconnect families, rescuing the enslaved loved ones of fugitives that she knows.
And this speaks to the great reality of slavery, that if you read, we've talked about slave narratives, the autobiographies that people who had escaped slavery very often wrote in the 1840s and 1850s. The most tragic chapters of those books, the passages that kind of where the pain just drips off the page, are always about the breakup of family. I think we slightly fetishize the violence of the slave system because it was horrific and it is shocking. But the thing that people write about with the most poignancy is the separation of couples, the sale of children. That desire to recreate the bonds of family broken by slavery is very, very deep.
And for Harriet, obviously, it becomes something that really drives her because first she's motivated to bring her own family back together, but increasingly then what she's doing is helping other families reassemble as well. And as so many working on the Underground Railroad did, she also helps a lot of the people that she brings out into the North. She helps them once they get there, finding work, finding housing, setting them up. So she doesn't just abandon them in the North.
And this becomes effectively who she is. I mean, this becomes her life by this point.
Yeah. For a decade, there is this kind of rhythm. It's seasonal, in fact, is the way that she lived. So she would earn money in the spring and summer, usually by doing domestic work, whatever she could get, where she was living. Then she would develop her plans, find out who it was that wanted to run, figure out where it was she was going to go, put together those plans in the autumn. And then she would conduct people, as we've said, in the winter, bring them north. And then she would lie low in New York or Canada until it was safe to move again. She had all kinds of strategies for avoiding detection when she was on an expedition. Sometimes people call them raids. I like that word too, because it is a bit of a raid. She's raiding into slave territory and pulling people out. She would sing a lot. She would sing slave spirituals as she was walking. And she did this, she said, because it actually made her look more ordinary. And again, this is part of her cleverness, is working out what people wouldn't expect. What they expect is for a fugitive or a conductor on the Underground Railroad to act furtive, to be secretive, to be trying to avoid detection. And she knew that that could actually draw attention to yourself. So she makes just enough noise to look ordinary. But the songs that she used also had encoded meanings. So she would let people know what the songs would indicate. So some songs mean it's safe, you can come join me. Other songs mean stay hidden, I've just seen a patroller, stay where you are. She kept going back to Maryland as well, where, of course, she had grown up, as we've said, where she had been hired out to many, many households. So there are lots of people around the area where she lived in Maryland who would recognize her, who knew that she was Minty Ross to them. And she would still go back and she would do things like one time she said she hid under it. She just put a big, large sunbonnet around her face so they couldn't see her. And that looked ordinary enough. But she was also carrying 2 chickens and she put strings on their legs. And she was holding them just in case something happened, which did happen, which was that somebody who had enslaved her approached close enough that they might have recognized her. And so she yanked on the strings of the chickens that she was holding so that they would start squawking and flapping. And then she bent down to look after the squawking and flapping chickens. And of course, the enslaver walks past and only notices, a black woman fussing with chickens and takes no notice of her and passes right by.
Because she's doing what he imagined she should be doing, caring for animals.
And it makes me smile because it is, to make chickens, flap and squawk so that nobody notices you as you pass by. It's just again, it's an indication of how quick-witted she was and how, well, I mean, that's not really quick-witted because she planned it, but how strategic she was and how well she understood what would act as camouflage, what they expected from a black woman, as you say, what they didn't expect from a black woman, and she could keep using that to her advantage. Similarly, by her late 20s, she's already being described as an old woman. This goes back to the point that we made earlier about how brutal lives for enslaved people were and how their bodies often, showed the signs of that brutality and scarring or injuries. But of course, it also showed itself in premature aging. But looking old also works to her advantage, because if she looks like this tiny, elderly black woman, then nobody is going to think that she's this audacious conductor on the Underground Railroad.
Yeah. And one advantage she has, whether old or young, is she looks harmless. She looks too small to be of danger. She's not solid enough, it seems. There's not enough of her for it to be a threat that she could undermine the finances. She could save people from this brutal system. And I think she really exploited that.
Totally exploited it. That's the word for it. And of course, she's a woman. And that's the other thing that she exploits is gradually her reputation will begin to precede her and people start to find out that there's this female conductor. But for many years, it wouldn't even occur to them that there would be a woman who would be leading these raids. And in addition to all of her ability to exploit the enslavers' assumptions against them, she was also ruthless in her methods. She was absolutely one of the reasons why she got so many people out was because she brooked no defiance and she would not let anybody risk other people. So she would carry opiates to quiet crying babies because a single noise could bring pursuers. So she'll dope the babies. I mean, look, that's what we're going to do because that's what's going to get us out.
There's lots of accounts of the Underground Railway of children being given alcohol or being given herbs to make them fall asleep because they could not risk a child crying out or a baby crying.
And you understand it. And presumably the babies survived the little bit of, drugging that happened on that night. And there's a reason why they made the choice that they made. A
life in slavery or risking drugging a child. It's a simple transaction.
Yeah, exactly. It's not actually the most difficult choice any of these people would make. There's one story about Harriet Tubman that everyone ends up repeating because it's so telling. It's just so indicative of the way that she worked. She was leading 25 people out from Maryland, so a large group, very, very dangerous. And they're moving through the marshlands. We were talking at the beginning of the story about how Maryland, the eastern shore of Maryland, is kind of swampy and marshy in these little river systems. So they're moving through, and remember, she moves in the winter. So they're moving through this wet, cold marshland. They're cold to the bone. They're hiding by day in swamps and reeds to evade pursuit. And after a couple of days like this, they are soaked, they're exhausted, they're freezing, they're terrified. And one man in the group decides that he's had enough. And he says he's going back, that he'd rather return to slavery than die under these conditions. And Harriet tells him he can't go back because it will endanger the whole group, including her, of course, but also the rest of the group, and that he can't risk everyone else's lives just because he's lost his nerve. The whole group tries to persuade him, but when it's time to move that night, he refuses to budge. And Harriet always carries a gun. And this story shows what she carried the gun for. It's not necessarily to use against slave catchers or bounty hunters. She turns the gun on the fugitive who doesn't want to run. She points it in his face and she says, "Move or die." And he moves. And she gets him out. Days later, she leads him into Canada. He's alive and he's free. I hope he thanked her. I don't know that he did. She deserved his thanks.
The physical toll of all of this on the people who she saved, but also on herself, because they're doing it once, she's doing it repeatedly. That must have been intense for a woman who'd already, wasn't very big, had already had a very bad injury as a young girl.
Yeah, it's important to say it's not only other people that she's making these demands on. As we've said, she's wearing out her own shoes. She's obviously putting herself through the same extreme physical conditions that she's putting these people through. But her own endurance and physical courage are just truly mind-boggling. There's another story where one time her teeth got infected. She had this terrible mouth infection, and she used the gun for something else. She took the butt of her pistol, knocked out her own front teeth, and kept moving. She's not going to let any little thing like her own front teeth get in the way of her mission. So the ruthlessness is absolute, and it's not only directed at other people. She is going to get those people out, whatever it takes.
As a conductor on the Underground Railway, she's finding groups through these networks of people who are willing to take the risk and try to get out. But she knows that there are still members of her own family still in slavery in Maryland.
Yeah. So she certainly hasn't abandoned them to their fate either. So along the way, during these years, she is returning to Maryland again and again and freeing members of her own family as well. So she frees 3 of her siblings. She had a large family, and bit by bit, she's getting them out. And they are adults. They are married with children often, and she gets those family groups out. And then she decides to rescue her parents. Now, her parents, as listeners will remember, have been freed, but that doesn't mean that they're safe. And in fact, her father has also been sheltering runaways in his cabin, and the word is spreading. So it's getting increasingly dangerous for him. And so Harriet decides that she's going to get them out. And of course, one of the advantages of working on the Underground Railroad means that she's totally connected to the whispering network. She knows she's got the intelligence. She knows what's happening to her family. Word is constantly traveling across these routes. Now, her parents by that point are too old to undertake this arduous journey that we've been talking about. So in this case, she borrows a wagon. And she just hides them under blankets and she just drives them 80 miles north. She just takes them. And then in Wilmington, she gets their passage to Canada and takes them to St. Catharines, the same border town where she has been gathering the rest of their family. And at that point, they join this kind of growing extended family. They join their 5 sons, their daughter, Harriet, several grandchildren, and even a great-grandchild.
And there must have been a temptation every time she returns to St. Catharines to not leave. She's managed against all of the odds in the most terrible of conditions to save a great proportion of her family, to bring them together in a free nation in Canada where they can no longer be enslaved. Each journey, each new member of the family brought together must have made it even harder to risk it all, to risk your own re-enslavement, to go and bring more people out.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And, for an enslaved family to be able to reunite like this is really rare. And that must have made, what you're saying even more the case, that you would just feel like I'm one of the few that's managed it. I've got my whole family here. I'm not going to risk it. And the risk is increased even more because by this point, Harriet's reputation is starting to build. Rumors of the female conductor are making their way around, and there's a price on her head. So there are reports circulating of a $12,000 reward for her capture at this point, which is around like $500,000 today, give or take. So it's an enormous amount of money to catch her. Her name is becoming well known. But of course, it's the days before photography, so no one really knows what she looks like. So even though her name is getting well known, she can continue to do this dangerous work.
And this work's getting more dangerous, not just because she is becoming infamous, because people have understood who she is and there is a bounty on her head. It's because of the decade in which this is now taking place. We are in the 1850s. We're in the years leading up to the American Civil War. And we should take a break there and then come back and discover how Harriet's activities feed into those events that are going to eventually spark the secession of the Southern states and the beginning of the Civil War. Welcome back to Journey Through Time. We've been talking about the life of Harriet Tubman, her campaign to save people from slavery through the Underground Railroad. By the middle of the 1850s, this issue of slavery is not just dominating her life, it is beginning to dominate the life of the American nation.
Yeah, the U.S. is really starting to come apart over slavery at this point. So before the break, we were saying how Harriet has this family that's been gathering in Canada. At this point, because she's increasingly, of course, well established in these abolitionist circles, the white abolitionists who are better off are helping support her in practical ways as best as they can. And one of the most important of her supporters plays an important part in the Civil War as well, a man named Senator William Seward, who listeners all the way back to our first episode on Black Tom might remember that we mentioned. Seward is a supporter of the Underground Railroad, and he sells Harriet a small house in his hometown of Auburn, New York, which gives her a permanent base, this little farm that she absolutely loves, and she's going to spend much of the rest of her life there. Seward is about to become Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. And in fact, he will be gravely wounded the night that Lincoln is assassinated, but Seward survives.
We also met him in our episodes about relationships between Britain and America during the American Civil War. So he's a figure who we've discussed with his antagonism towards Britain, but that is another story and another podcast.
Literally.
This is Seward at his best, actually. This is a much nicer William Seward because he was an opponent of slavery.
And he was a complicated person. And that's why he's, such an interesting historical figure. But yes, he was a staunch opponent of slavery. He was a very important abolitionist. And, remembering Seward's relationship to both Lincoln and to Harriet Tubman kind of puts us on the path to the Civil War that is coming. Because as we've said, also in those episodes on the Civil War, the crisis point really is over the Western expansion of slavery. Now, what happens is that after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, there's another really divisive act, which is in 1854, when Congress passes the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And what that does is it opens up the new Western territories to the possibility that they might become slave states, and what will decide it is popular vote.
Yeah, this was supposed to be a compromise, but it actually becomes a trigger.
It leads to total chaos because what happens is pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flood into the Kansas territory, both trying to fix the outcome.
Yeah, because if enough supporters of Kansas becoming a slave state can settle there, then they will, when the referendum comes, they'll be able to dominate it. They'll be able to use the land that they've seized to create plantations and in their imaginations get rich through the labor of enslaved Africans.
And because people know that that's what the pro-slavery forces are doing, anti-slavery forces flood in to resist them. They come from the Northeast And they come in to try to establish the foundations of what they are determined will be a free state. So unsurprisingly, listeners will not be amazed to hear that it turns violent quickly. So there are border skirmishes, raids, shootings, there are burnings, there are lynchings, and newspapers start to call this violence Bleeding Kansas. And right in the middle of Bleeding Kansas is another figure that we have named before. We're going to keep, when we get to American history in the 19th century, there are some key figures who will keep coming back because they were pivotal figures. And one of them is a man named John Brown.
John Brown's not a figure who's very well remembered outside of the United States, but he's one of those key figures who many people at the time felt that his life, what he had done, had been one of the triggers that had led to the Civil War.
I don't think there's any question historically that he was. But as you say, it was very well recognized at the time and for long afterwards. Yeah, so he's a radical abolitionist. He's fanatical, a religious terrorist. He is. He's just a terrorist on the side that we agree with because he's a terrorist on the side of abolition. So he's convinced that he's the instrument of divine justice. A bit like Harriet being certain that she's on a mission from God to rescue enslaved people. And John Brown also looks like a fanatical religious, self-styled prophet. He's got the wild beard and the Old Testament stare, and there are photos of him. And he's absolutely certain that the fight against slavery is a violent fight, that it will not be settled by persuasion or argument alone. And since the 1830s, he's been one of the loudest voices in the abolition movement. He's connected to most of the major abolitionists. And of course, he quarrels with them constantly, as you won't be surprised to hear about tactics and what they need to do. In 1856, in Kansas, during this time known as Bleeding Kansas or Bloody Kansas, when there are these violent skirmishes going on between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces, pro-slavery gangs attack the town of Lawrence, Kansas. And this is one of the skirmishes. In retaliation, John Brown leads a small group who kill 5 pro-slavery men. So it's eye for an eye. It's straight retaliatory justice. And they grab these men out of their homes and they hack them to death with knives at Osawatomie Creek and leave their bodies out exposed by the road at dawn as a warning. It horrified the country. It's a horrific act of violence, whatever your politics. But to John Brown, he is enacting divine justice. And he famously tells his friends, his followers, after Osawatomie Creek, "I have only a short time to live, only one death to die, and I will die fighting for this cause. There will be no more peace in this land until slavery is done for."
And now John Brown was set on this path of violent resistance to slavery, to try to bring down slavery through an armed rebellion.
Yeah, so a couple years later, by 1858, he's moved north, convinced that political arguments aren't going to work. And so he's planning the next phase. And what he decides he's going to do is to start the Civil War. He decides he's going to invade the South and arm the enslaved. In order to do that, he goes to Canada to raise money and to recruit followers. And while he's there, he meets Harriet Tubman. Now, you can see why they'd be drawn to each other. As we've said, they're both convinced that they're on a mission from God. But they also both think that God wants action, that he doesn't want you to be patient and wait for, his divine plan to unfold. They both believe that God wants you to get right in there and make his plan, what you think is his plan, come about. So they meet and they start plotting. They start talking about strategy, about how they can start something that can't be stopped. And he tells her that he's planning a raid. He's going to raid the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Harpers Ferry is a key U.S. armory. It's full of weapons. And Brown's plan is a simple one. He's going to go to the armory. He's going to seize the weapons and he's going to hand them to the enslaved.
It is rather similar to the plans of the revolution about seizing the armories and seizing the sources of weapons. This is not something that's new in American history, but this is an idea to put those weapons in the hands of enslaved people.
And Harriet is a big fan of this plan. She's enthusiastic. She wants to help however she can. And there is a really crucial way in which she can help because she knows Virginia really well after 7 years of guiding people on foot across it. She knows the routes. She knows the terrain. She knows who might join. She knows how you move through hostile country. She knows how to recognize the signals of, enemies and friends. She's got all the practical intelligence that he needs for the uprising that he's planning. So much so that John Brown calls her General Tubman. She is his general, and she really plays a vital role in helping John Brown plan the raid, even though she doesn't play a role in executing it.
The raid on Harpers Ferry is one of those events that is in the drumbeat of crises that leads to the Civil War. It is also one of those great disasters in the history of violent political terror action.
Yes, indeed it is. So early on the morning of October 16th, 1859, John Brown and a small band of 21 men cut the telegraph lines leading into Harpers Ferry, and they moved to seize the arsenal. Their idea, which will sound familiar to you, David, is that once they begin the raid with this very small band, the enslaved people in the surrounding plantations will be so inspired by their movement that they will join up and launch a general uprising.
Yeah, it's the constant delusion of fanatics of every political stripe, is that if they strike the match and start the fire, that it will explode, that other people will rush to their side. And any plan that involves an uprising, whether it's enslaved people, whether it's religious minorities, those are the plans that almost always fall apart.
I feel like this is the David Olusoga lesson from Journey Through Time is, you can't schedule an uprising like a delivery slot.
It's just such a long list of history of plans where, I've always said if you're planning an insurrection and someone says, and at this point the people will rise up, it's time to sneak out of the room, change your name, get on a train, get on a plane, because that plan is doomed.
It is over. So we've seen it with Hitler's beer hall putsch. We've seen it with Guy Fawkes and the gunpowder plot. We will see it again in stories that we tell in the future, can guarantee it. But this story of John Brown and Harpers Ferry is certainly for American history probably the most consequential failed uprising. And it utterly collapses instantly.
Yeah. The local enslaved people don't rise up. The local enslaved people who understand acutely what the consequences will be to them if they take arms, if they fight against this system, who've heard the legends of all of the failed slave uprisings going back literally centuries, they don't rise up. You can see why they wouldn't rise up. You can see why 21 fanatics trying to raid an arsenal does not to them sound like the route out of slavery.
Yeah. And crucially, Brown hadn't done the groundwork, right? So he just swoops in and thinks that they're going to be so inspired that they're going to follow his waving banner. And they don't know who this guy is. So as you say, it's way too dangerous, but he also hasn't built those alliances that might inspire people to follow him. He's been off plotting in Canada, which doesn't mean anything to enslaved people in Virginia. So 2 days after John Brown takes Harpers Ferry, federal troops under Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart surround the armory. They storm the building. They kill or capture most of Brown's men. Brown himself is taken alive, but wounded. He's arrested, of course, and he's put on trial for treason.
And this is Robert E. Lee as a member of the U.S. Army.
Indeed. So both Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart, who will become very important Confederate commanders, are at this point, we haven't declared war yet. This is still the Union. All of this is the Union. And so it's important to bear in mind here that Brown is being put on trial for treason, not by the Confederacy, but by the Union. So Brown himself is on trial for treason, found instantly guilty, and on December 2nd, 1859, he's hanged. His final words become legendary. He said, "The crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood."
And he becomes the ultimate martyr figure for the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement in America. The idea of, John Brown's body moldering in the grave becomes the great, hymn of those who want to bring slavery to an end one way or another.
Yeah, a lot of people might know the tune without knowing that it's the song about John Brown. And yeah, so it fails instantly, the raid, but its impact is enormous. It is a crucial accelerant on the road to civil war because it convinces the South that armed rebellion is coming, and it convinces the North the compromise is impossible. Now, as you said, Harriet Tubman is not at Harpers Ferry herself, but she is absolutely part of the circle that shapes this raid. She is right at the center of the militant abolitionist network that helps push the nation to the breaking point. So Harriet Tubman is directly in the chain of events that help push the United States toward civil war over the question of slavery.
And she's by now well known. She's heavily implicated in this failed, disastrous raid on Harper's Ferry. She is an infamous figure at this point.
Yeah. So by the summer of 1860, as we're coming up to the outbreak of war, stories about Harriet Tubman have been circulating for years. They've started calling her the She-Moses. And the woman conductor. Increasingly, they know her name, but still, as we've said before, people don't know what she looks like. This is when one of the earliest reports of Harriet Tubman as a conductor on the Underground Railroad is published, one of the earliest surviving reports. And this is from the summer of 1860 at a women's rights convention in Boston, because Harriet Tubman was also a staunch supporter of women's rights. And there was an article headlined, "A Female Conductor of the Underground Railroad." So by 1860, her activities are known and they are linked with the name Harriet Tubman. She's described as, quote, "the colored woman Harriet Tubman, who has been 8 times south and run north no less than 40 persons." And it is said that she's given a prolonged and enthusiastic reception by the crowd in Boston. Now, those numbers are not necessarily accurate. I'm quoting it simply to show that her reputation as a conductor on the Underground Railroad is now well enough established that it is making newspapers.
And it's in the newspapers as the country is beginning the final descent into the disaster that is the Civil War.
Yeah. So within 6 months, the country is on the brink. By December 1860, Lincoln has won the election. South Carolina has voted to secede in response, and several other deep South states are about to follow. It's a national rupture that's gone past the point of no return. And at this point, in December 1860, Harriet Tubman makes one last rescue in Maryland, bringing several more people north to Canada just before the war breaks out. It's absolutely amazing. I mean, she just never played it safe. So everything's incredibly dangerous. She gets one more group of people to Canada, and then finally, her friends and her family prevail for a little while and convince her to lay low for a bit at her farm in Auburn, New York. And at that point, as Harriet Tubman is for once taking a pause, the Civil War breaks out on April 12th, 1861. And Harriet Tubman is about to take everything that she's learned, the roots, the codes, the discipline, and now turn it from tactics that enable her to help enslaved people get to freedom and turn it into military intelligence in the Civil War.
And this is the last and in some ways the least known chapter in the kind of crazy, remarkable life of Harriet Tubman, as well as being a conductor on the Underground Railroad, as well as being someone who liberates, dozens of people from slavery, that she herself in the Civil War is prevailed upon by the Union forces to become a scout, to become a spy, to operate behind enemy lines. And that last dramatic chapter in the story of Harriet Tubman is the story we'll be telling next time in our final episode.
I hope you join us then.